So once again, we thank everyone for gathering with us here today at the Rural FASD support meeting. And we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by Jenn Drudge of Adopt for Life. This is a presentation we have been hearing about for a while, and I know that you have done a lot of work on this, and we're really looking forward to hearing about it around this complex issue of aggression toward families and caregivers. And we certainly know from our own lived experience, this is always a situation that's always difficult to understand and how to deal with. So we thank you so much, Jenn, for joining us today. And at this point, I do want to do our land acknowledgement, where we are currently here on the unceded and traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, and particularly the Algonquin First Nation. And we thank them for the opportunity to be able to work, play, and pray here on this land. And so at this point, Jenn, I turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. You can see by my background that I wish I were at the beach today, and I'm sad I'm not, but I can always pretend like I'm there. I'm just so excited to share about our AFCCA program today. And you'll notice the title of this presentation is Weathering the Storm. And this is an issue. AFCCA, which I'm going to be talking about in a moment, is an issue that so many people are dealing with across Canada and North America, and many are silent about it. There's not enough known about it. And the purpose of our AFCCA program at Adopt for Life is to raise as much awareness as possible, and also to try to come alongside and help caregivers who are living with AFCCA as much as possible. So I am the provincial parent liaison for our AFCCA program at Adopt for Life. And you'll hear in a minute, but AFCCA stands for Aggression Towards Family and Caregivers in Childhood and Adolescence. And you can see I've got an email down there. If anyone would like to get in touch with me or follow up, you're absolutely welcome to do that. I would welcome anybody to get in touch. And I'm just one member of our team, and I wanted to speak a little bit about our amazing team. Those who are very involved in the FASD community might recognize a few of these faces. Nancy Lockwood is our co-director and practice lead, and she was very instrumental in founding the Fetal Alcohol Resource Program in Ottawa. And our clinicians on staff are Tanya Eichler and Maud Champagne, and they as well have a great deal of experience in the FASD world, and they are really the heart of our program, because they're offering a lot of one-to-one therapeutic supports to caregivers and group support to caregivers as well. So a little bit about this term AFCCA. When I approach this topic, a lot of people look at me and go, I've never heard this term before, and that's completely fine, because it's a very new term in Canada. And we are trying as hard as we can to raise awareness so that it becomes a common term that everyone knows and understands. You may have heard of CPVA in the past, which would be child-to-parent violence and aggression. So there was a national consortium held throughout Canada 2 years ago in 2021. And you can see the link at the bottom of my slide here, where you can actually look up this national consortium study. I highly recommend you check that website out and give that study a read. It is very eye-opening. And what came out of that national consortium, there were caregivers, youth, children, as well as professionals who were asked what they thought of the term CPVA, child-to-parent violence and aggression. And what came out of that really was that the word violence was highly stigmatizing, and it also didn't completely encompass what families were experiencing. So for example, a home where you have a child with FASD who expresses a lot of verbal aggression, maybe property damage, or kind of psychological, emotional manipulation, violence wasn't the correct word to identify that. But when you say the word aggression, then suddenly caregivers and children and youth can say, yeah, I feel like that's what I'm experiencing, this sense that I'm walking on eggshells trying to avoid an outburst. I know I'm not being physically punched or beaten, but the words being thrown at me have this mental health toll that feels kind of like I'm in a domestic violence situation. So the term AFCCA was come up with, and really it stems from a pattern of behavior in childhood or adolescence. And it's characterized by aggressive behavior by a child or adolescent toward family members or caregivers. Often siblings are involved in this circle as well. And it does cause significant harm, not just to the person the behavior is directed towards, but what we found through this consortium was that it's causing a lot of harm also to the child or youth who is directing the behavior. And there's a lot of stigma and shame. So if a caregiver is experiencing something like this in their home, they approach a professional, a family doctor, a counselor, a teacher in their community, or a fellow parent, and they describe what they're experiencing. And people don't really know how to take it. And they might be used to hearing of a parent physically abusing a child, but they don't often hear of the opposite, and they don't really know how to help. And they may give bad advice. And so it deepens this sense of shame in the entire family. And a lot of times caregivers end up not coming forward and not sharing, or they're afraid that if they do share, Child and Family Services might be called on them, or their child might be removed from the home. So there's a lot of fear and shame involved in this whole thing. And so really the point of our AFCCA program is to bring it out into the light and to help caregivers not experience that sense of shame and isolation, and that being part of a community of others who understand and know exactly what they're going through can definitely help. As a little bit of background before I move on, I will say that I am an adoptive caregiver myself. We have 6 children in my home, 3 children who experience FASD, 2 biological children, 4 adopted, and we have experienced AFCCA in our home. And so my role on the team is really to come alongside caregivers as someone who's been there, as someone who understands what is happening in their home. And in that way, there's a lot less judgment. And it's not just a professional who's never lived with it 24/7 trying to give you advice. So we're really excited to that on our team, everyone represented has in some way been touched by adoption, because we know this is a huge thing for adoptive families. But I did want to mention, AFCCA obviously is not just experienced by adoptive families, it's experienced by kin families, biological families. We just don't want to limit our lens either. Even though I'm from Adopt for Life, I'm sharing with you as a caregiver, knowing that we come from all different backgrounds. So this idea of weathering the storm, our clinician mode came up with this analogy after interviewing and talking to so many families and realizing that what they were experiencing in their home was really just kind of like a tornado. There's a tornado happening in the home, and the family is being blown all over the place and cannot find stability. And it's like they're being totally bowled over by the aggression they're experiencing in their home. And what we were finding was the only way caregivers can weather that storm is if they have a great deal of support around them. And if the child or adolescent has a great deal of support around them, and that families cannot weather this storm alone. So there are often, I would say pretty much 100% of the time, there are going to be coexisting neurodevelopment disabilities and related conditions to those who are expressing AFCCA. FASD is certainly a huge component. We are supporting currently hundreds of families who are experiencing AFCCA, and our latest tracking metric is that about 90% of them have someone in the home who represents FASD, and also anxiety disorder. So anxiety and FASD are kind of going hand in hand. And I mean, it's obviously not limited. We're also seeing a lot of families who are represented from the autism community, developmental trauma, attachment disorder, sleep disorder, mood disorders. So they all kind of are in the mix as contributing factors. But what we are finding is the way we approach AFCCA and the way we decrease the aggression that caregivers are experiencing can be similar across all of the different sectors. So you can see here our little flower, and we've got our child or adolescent in the middle. And this is just a little picture to show that that child or adolescent is not in their own bubble, and that the aggression that's happening in the home, it's reaching out and it's affecting all around them. Their parents and caregivers, their siblings, their community, school, neighborhood, maybe church, any kind of community groups that child is a part of or adolescent is going to be touched by AFCCA in some way. And these are just a few things that came out of the consortium in terms of what parents and caregivers would want you to know. So maybe some of you who are watching today, maybe for the first time are realizing this AFCCA term, yeah, that is what I'm experiencing. I didn't have a name for it before, but I have a name for it now. So what caregivers want people to know is that they are experiencing, as we already referenced, immense shame, blame from others, stigma. Sometimes they're experiencing a lot of judgmental comments from people kind of on the outside looking in who don't really understand what that caregiver is dealing with every day. And that they're living with an unexpectedly high level and frequency of dangerous behaviors in the home. So a lot of times, and I experienced this myself as a caregiver, you might share, this is what's happening with my teenager, for example. And you might get the response from someone, oh yeah, you know, the teenage stage or typical teenage behavior. Now I know because I'm raising children on various ends of the spectrum as well as biological children, that what I was experiencing was not typical teenage behavior, because the frequency, it wasn't just, you know, a hole is punched in the wall once every 6 months. A lot of times these behaviors are daily in a family that's experiencing AFCCA. It's not just a child gets frustrated once a month and swears at their parent. It could be every hour they're lashing out and swearing at their parent. So it's definitely a much higher level of frequency than what you would see in kind of the average family, if you will. I hate using the term average, but it kind of gives an idea here. And AFCCA is experienced by both adoptive and biological families, absolutely. And another issue is that families are having to fight to remain together. So as we all know, a lot of times the support systems that are offered to us, we're going to reference this a little later, are absolutely not even close to what we need. So we're not getting the respite provision that we need. When we do reach out, perhaps we're working with a Children's Aid Society, and the only option that is given to us is we can't help you on one end, or if you are going to need help with this child, you're going to have to sign over your parental rights, and the child enters the system full time. There's no in between, there's no extra supports offered. And it's really just these roadblocks and barriers that are snowballing the effect AFCCA has in our home. So one thing we're doing at Adopt for Life is that we're employing kind of 3 therapeutic strategies to try to help families with some of the problems I just addressed. So one of them is the polyvagal theory. And basically, the polyvagal theory is a way I've actually helped with a number of our polyvagal groups. And it's a way for you as a caregiver to learn how to regulate your own nervous system. So when I first started learning about polyvagal, I had never heard the term caregiver PTSD, but I sure know what it is now. And I realize that that was what I was living in for many years. So we have a significant amount of families who have caregivers experiencing caregiver PTSD. And even when the threat of aggression has left the home. Perhaps their child has entered a treatment facility for helping them. The parent or caregiver is still experiencing a lot of anxiety, fear, nervous system response. We have a number of parents who are retired from the military, who never experienced PTSD when they served overseas in the military, but they definitely experienced caregiver PTSD. So that just goes to show you how intense it is living 24/7 with AFCCA. That it's actually more intense to many caregivers than being on the front lines of war. So polyvagal is really just a process we take caregivers through. And I'm going to show you a little bit about polyvagal coming up, but it absolutely is one of the most helpful things to help caregivers kind of regulate their own system before they move on to the next step, which is neuro de-escalation. So this is about using safe presence and attuned strategies to help de-escalate based on bottom-up brain connection and communication. And our clinicians have a lot of really great strategies in terms of neuro de-escalation that I don't have time to share here, but it also kind of connects with our third little element, which is nonviolent resistance. And I'm going to share a lot about nonviolent resistance in a minute, but this is certainly a groundbreaking model for caregiving and AFCCA. And we are doing a lot of NVR intensives in our program, which are helping it, you know, to be honest, the aggression doesn't always decrease, but the caregiver's capacity to handle it definitely increases and their confidence increases. So a little bit about the polyvagal, if you haven't heard of it before, it's kind of a ladder going up and down. And at the top, we have our ventral vagal system, middle is our sympathetic, and bottom is our dorsal. And AFCCA family, both the caregivers and the children are often stuck in the bottom two. So sympathetic is your fight or flight response, and dorsal is what I would call your burnout response. So because you're caregiving a child who maybe has some behaviors that are making it unsafe for everyone in the home, you are constantly being hyper vigilant and you're stuck in fight or flight. And even when your child goes to school and you're at home by yourself and everything's calm and peaceful, your nervous system is still stuck in fight or flight and you just can't relax. And you can only handle that fight or flight for so long before your system completely collapses. And we hear a lot of caregivers who are stuck in kind of this world of depression, no energy. They don't have time to do anything they enjoy anymore. They actually say over and over again, I have no hope, I have no joy in my life anymore. And they're right at the bottom of that ladder. So our therapeutic approach and our groups we use for polyvagal and our one-to-one clinician support is all about trying to help caregivers find the top of the ladder, which is our safety response. This is where we feel connected to the world and the people that are around us. This is where we feel like we can be safely relaxed. And I will tell you from personal experience and many caregivers that I am also have the joy of working with, that many of us have not felt ventral vagal, or before we started polyvagal theory, we'd never felt at the top of that ladder safe and connected. We hadn't felt that way, not just in days or weeks or months, but in years. And we actually couldn't remember when the last time it was that we just felt genuinely happy and joyful and not afraid. So this is just something that is just very useful and in helping caregivers find the top again. And there's a lot of tactics that go into finding it again as well. And then our neuro de-escalation, many of us as parents might fall in, or grandparents, aunts or uncles, we might fall into one of these two patterns. So joint escalation, I come from a big Irish family, and I would definitely say pattern one is our pattern, which is when your child raises their voice, you raise your voice, and then your child shouts and you shout louder, and it's kind of a contest of the wills, and you as the caregiver definitely be the one that's last and having that authority. And it really, in a case of parenting children or youth who are not neurotypical, it's so ineffective. And then but it's what we're used to. Historically, this is how our families parented, and it's not working for us. And then there's pattern 2, which is giving in escalation. And this is when your child shouts or makes demand, and you just get worn down and worn down and worn down, and eventually you just give in because you're tired of fighting. And then the child learns that, okay, if I keep practicing this behavior, then I'm eventually going to get my way. And this is becoming, I would say, in our modern age, a much more common way to parent. So you might fall into one of either camp. Maybe you're a combination of both. And the idea of de-escalation and co-regulation is really trying to learn strategies that, first of all, I'm going to talk about number 2, which is slowing down and grounding yourself as a caregiver. It's not giving in, but it's also not becoming this louder and louder and louder. It's slowing down your response. A lot of times, number 3 here, match intensity, not emotion. So many of us have been told, we may have been taking parenting courses before we became a parent. Many of us are told, if your child is escalating, you should respond very quiet and calm. And if they are yelling, I hate this, I can't do this, your response should be, I hear you, I hear what you have to say. And what we're learning actually in AFCCA families is that increases the aggression, because now the child or the youth is just absolutely annoyed and ticked off that their concerns are not being heard. And this is something that's kind of flipping our what we're being taught as a culture or a society about parenting and saying, you know what? It's probably not the best response. If you can think of yourself in a partnership or a marriage situation, if you come to your spouse with something that you're really upset about and they are very quiet and nonchalant in their response, it makes you more upset. So one thing we're trying to help caregivers realize is it's okay to match intensity. So if a child is really upset and it's okay to be, oh my gosh, I hear that you are really upset about this. This is really concerning to me too. What are we going to do about it? And just that little switch sometimes can immediately make the child feel heard and decrease the aggression they're directing towards you. So just those are two little tactics that are just quick de-escalation strategies that we've been employing that have found to be helpful. But the other one, number 1 here, is to create a safety plan. Many caregivers do not know what a safety plan is. They've never done one before, or they have had a social worker or somebody do a safety plan with them and it really wasn't helpful. It was definitely not in-depth enough. And so we encourage everyone, if you've made a safety plan and it's not working, to revisit it or find someone who is trained in safety planning to make one with you. So we do have a lot of resources in terms of safety planning. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like some resources for that in making your own safety plan. But sometimes a caregiver just needs to go through the process to realize that, for one, it's okay to call the police. It's okay to call the ambulance if you are very unsafe with a child or youth in your home. A lot of caregivers don't realize this is an option and this can be part of our plan. It's okay to walk away and leave the home if you are unsafe. And we have a lot of really good tips in terms of safety planning, different areas where, for example, many people don't think they have supporters or people they can call on in an emergency. So one of our roles is to help caregivers brainstorm, is there a neighbor who could quick come when things are escalating in your home and you could text them and say, come borrow sugar. Could you talk to them in advance about this process? And this neighbor, whenever you text them, just comes over and walks straight in your door, doesn't even knock, and asks to borrow sugar and or milk, whatever it might be. And we found this kind of situation puts the child or the adolescent very kind of shocked and surprised. Somebody new is in the situation, somebody is viewing their behavior, and immediately the aggression stops, because aggression thrives in secrecy. So as we sit with caregivers and make a safety plan, a lot of it is about bringing the secret out into the open and involving as many people as you can in this secret, so that a child or youth knows there are so many others in the community that are really concerned about this behavior, who really care about the child and the caregiver and want everybody to be safe. So this is a big piece of our safety planning process, as well as when you're in the moment experiencing aggression, you're often also not even thinking about what could I do next. So if you've got a paper, something posted somewhere, similar to if there was a fire in your home, if everybody's looked at it, practiced it, knows what to do, then when you are in an emergency as a caregiver, you're going to know what to do too. And you can quickly look at that list, call that number, employ that tactic. And it really is something that's helpful that we hope more and more caregivers can start using. I talked about calling on supporters and a bit of the distraction piece as well. The nourish piece is something we've been finding more and more, that aggression, sometimes it's just because kids are hangry. So this is just a really simple tool. Our distract and nourish is when a child is yelling at you, to just walk over to the fridge, grab a yogurt tube or whatever it is, and just silently pass it to their child. And again, kind of throws the child off, give them something to eat, and it reduces the aggression in the home. So a little bit about nonviolent resistance. I referenced it earlier. This is an approach and research that was put forward by Ham Omer, who is from Israel. And NVR has been practiced in Europe and has now made its way to Canada. We're really excited as an organization to be able to offer NVR, and many of us on staff have been getting training with it. And the idea is we are not trying to ignore the aggression. We're not trying to tell the child it's okay. We're in fact standing against it. So we're not fighting back in a violent way ourselves, but we are taking a stand against it to try to make it stop. So there are many components to nonviolent resistance, but the number one, I would say, that comes out of this process is helping caregivers realize their own personal values and creating boundaries so that they can live their values. So for example, a caregiver raising a child with FASD, maybe one of their values is that we don't swear at others and we don't treat others like garbage verbally, if I can be frank. And that's a value as a caregiver. And they're feeling constantly all day long like that value is being totally picked at and ignored. And in fact, that it's not even okay to have that value because their child is not neurotypical. So they just have to put up with what they're experiencing. But a lot of this NVR process is realizing that deep down, that actually is a value and we want to stand against it. And it's helping caregivers discover different ways they can stand against it. It's building a community of supporters that will come around them and help them live that value and help communicate to the child, this is not okay. You cannot treat your mom, your dad, your grandma, your grandpa in this way. And we're so concerned that we're standing together with your grandma, your grandpa, your aunt, your uncle, your mom, your dad. And we're going to stand together with them against what you're directing at them until it stops. So I don't have time to describe today. It would take me hours and hours to describe how that process works. But in doing that, caregivers are also discovering that boundaries are really important for them and that boundaries with your child are absolutely acceptable. And we've been told for years and years, especially with attachment theory, that we need to constantly be with our child and they'll feel abandoned if we're not with them. But it's okay when you're experiencing AFCCA to a great degree. We need to rebalance the scale of all of the heavy we're experiencing with support. So anyone experiencing AFCCA, actually, they need more time away from their child than the average caregiver does, if I can use that word average again. They actually need more restorative time where someone else is taking care of them and helping to repair their nervous system than someone who isn't feeling aggression. But our society doesn't support that. Oftentimes, those that are experiencing aggression in the home have much less support. Often those raising children or youth with FASD have much less support as a caregiver and less people they can rely on. So part of our NVR process is brainstorming and reaching out and trying to get these caregivers as much support as possible. And they may be totally burnt out and not able to reach out and get that support themselves. So we can be advocates. We can be someone who reaches out on their behalf. So that's just a little bit about NVR and what we are discovering through this process. It's about a year into our NVR program, and we are noticing that caregivers are suddenly feeling a lot more confident. And what we're hearing again and again is caregivers saying, I feel like now I matter. And for so long, it's all child focused. And we're not saying our children aren't wonderful and our youth aren't important and valuable. But for so long, a lot of the tactics is very child focused. Every therapy is focused on the child and not on taking care of the caregiver. So the process of NVR is really about saying to the caregiver, you're a human being too, you matter, your mental health matters. And in fact, your child or adolescent is going to do much better if you are doing better. So that's just a little bit about NVR. And I wanted to share a piece about shame. You can actually find a video we made on our Adopt for Life YouTube channel. It's a great channel. We have a whole playlist of AFCCA videos if you're interested in checking them out. And we're discovering more and more as our AFCCA team helps families is that shame is kind of the underlying emotion that everyone is experiencing. And there's a difference between guilt and shame. So guilt is something that you perhaps would experience if you have done something wrong, you feel guilty about it. Say a teacher calls and says something about your kid and you yell at the teacher. And you feel badly about it afterwards, and you might call and say, I'm sorry, I overreacted. I'm just having a really bad day. That's guilt. So guilt is something you may have actually done wrong, and guilt drives you to do something to repair what went wrong. Shame is a whole different beast. Shame is actually just this deep feeling of, I don't matter, I'm unworthy, deep shame and embarrassment and isolation. It causes you to hide instead of repair things. It causes you to not want to reach out for help. And both what we're seeing in AFCCA families is that both the caregivers and the child or youth are experiencing deep shame. And the only antidote to that shame is support, validation, compassion, and helping a caregiver stand firm in their values, what we were talking about already. So this is just kind of one piece that we're trying to address. And it really is something that is not talked about nearly often enough. And this piece of community of supporters, so I already used the term that aggression thrives in secrecy, and it leads to you feeling very powerless. So I know as a caregiver, when I finally started sharing what was going on in my home with safe people who I knew would understand, my shame just started to disappear. Suddenly I wasn't nearly so embarrassed, and now I'm kind of an open book in terms of sharing what I've experienced and helping others. And the role of community supporters is really important. So what you need is respite and relationships for your child. So your child needs to be able to have relationships with other people in the community. So it offers a support both for you as a caregiver, but for them as the child, because it's going to increase their sense of confidence and being loved and cared for. We've already talked about some of our a little tiny bit about some de-escalation help, but that's one thing that caregivers are really looking for, that we need to become more trained in as a community of supporters around them, as professional supporters as well. And oftentimes community supports offer ideas and problem solving. So when we talk about being dorsal at the bottom of that polyvagal ladder, you're not thinking of new ideas. And sometimes you might ask a caregiver, who could help you in this situation? And they'll just flat out say, nobody. I've tried everything. Believe me, I've tried. And that is true. They're defeated. They have reached out so many times and been rejected so many times that they just cannot bring themselves to try again. So that's where community support really comes in, so that we can try to maybe prove that concept wrong, that there are people who care, they just didn't know how to help. And maybe we can be a little more specific in our asks. So I know, for example, we have some families that say, I have no extended family around that can help. So grandma lives in Alberta, we live in Ontario. Well, you know what? Grandma can still help. So when a child is escalated, if you've talked to grandma in advance, sometimes if you call grandma on the cell and you just put it on speakerphone and grandma's voice comes on and suddenly she's talking while your child is yelling at you, and the child suddenly stops because they don't want grandma to hear what they're doing. And actually they might want to have a conversation to grandma about what's going on. So this is a way that we can help caregivers think creatively about how are some ways actually we can get your extended family to help, even if they don't live close by. And oftentimes extended friends or family really want to help. And that's something, a task we can give them to do that will introduce support into our home. And I also, just in terms of these values that we're talking about, one is the value of self-care. So self-care, we have discovered in our AFCCA community, is almost a dirty word. So people hear self-care that are experiencing the depths of raising neurodiversity, of living with AFCCA, and they literally just roll their eyes. Self-care is like, they're like, I can't have a bubble bath to get my way out of this, of what I'm experiencing. Self-care in their value system sounds selfish. So a lot of what we are trying to do is help caregivers rethink this concept of self-care. And we've actually changed the name to restorative time in our community from self-care, because restorative time is more about you replenishing and restoring and re-energizing as a caregiver to be able to care for others. Many times, I know, particularly in the adoptive community, the reason we adopted in the first place was because the value system we grew up with was I put others first, I put my community first, I do something for someone else, and it's self-sacrifice, which, I mean, that can be a beautiful thing, but when you are self-sacrificing to the point that you are being destroyed, it's not a good thing. And this is what many, many caregivers who live with AFCCA are experiencing, that they are self-sacrificing to the point that their self is being destroyed bit by bit. So the whole value system when it comes to self-care is something, you can see these questions on my screen that are really good to just sit down, write down, and think about your answers. You know, what needs to change in order for me to be able to take care of myself? Many times in families, it could be a single parent and they say, I just can't, like, this is actually impossible. So what needs to change is our community needs to come around them, and our community needs to step up with respite. What needs to change is we may need to have a neighbor or family member come take our child for one afternoon every week to go play Scrabble or take them to the movies or something, so that we actually have that time. So it's making a list of what needs to change. And then the big question is, what if my child doesn't change? Can I still find joy, presence, and happiness? And that is something that I know personally I've discovered as a caregiver, that yes, I can, even though I felt pretty hopeless about it, that actually when I refigure out my boundaries and my own values, that how I'm feeling isn't dependent on my child's behavior. This is just something that it takes a long time, but it's part of, if anyone's done acceptance and commitment therapy, that's a big piece of it, is that maybe there's certain things about my neurodiverse child that will never change. They, you know, perhaps they'll never know how to manage money or hold down a job. But if that's the case, how can I still learn to find joy, presence, and happiness in my life, and not getting stuck in the feelings of hopelessness when I look forward to the future? Learning to live in the moment. as well, and prioritizing yourself again, and realizing that prioritizing yourself is not selfish. It's just, I mean, it's just recognizing that you have equal value as a human being as every other human being. Everyone in your home has equal value and needs to be cared for equally. And a big part of our program also is that we've developed a lot of resources. So I wanted to share just a couple. These are some tip sheets that we're starting to develop. We actually have a lot of them. We've talked here about rallying supporters around us in our community. We have a number of worksheets that are fillable printables as we brainstorm through this. And relational gestures is something I haven't touched on a lot in this presentation, but this is about giving grace and reconciliation gestures to your child, even when you think they might not deserve it or they're not returning those relational gestures, how we can do that as a caregiver and how we can feel more confident in showing them love. So we have tip sheets like this, worksheets to fill out, as well as videos to go along with them to kind of give more information. So again, if that's something you're interested in, absolutely reach out to our community so we can get you in touch with some of these resources. And what I kind of wanted to, you can tell I started this presentation where we were talking about a lot of the heavy stuff, and I wanted to talk just about some of our hope going forward into the future, both as an organization and as an AFCCA community throughout Canada. So one of our big goals is that we want to provide multi-sector training so that professionals that caregivers approach will know what AFCCA is, and they will know how to support that caregiver without judgment and support them properly. And we want to kind of work on changing the language, non-stigmatizing language. So for example, we have many caregivers who have their child perhaps is in a temporary care agreement with the local CAS for safety reasons. Their child may be living not with them in the home. Maybe they're living with other kin, or they are in a residential treatment center. And one of the things that came up again and again and again is that families were told by professionals and judged by others around them and told that they were abandoning their child, or that they were no longer that child's parent, because the child was not in their home full time. So one thing that we're really trying to push and educate across the board in many different sectors is that no, that's not the case. If a child is not in the home for safety reasons, it's a co-parenting situation actually. This is still very much the caregiver and the parent. It's just there are other supports that are needed to help this family. And there is absolutely no language necessary about abandoning a child or signing over parental rights or anything like that. You can see at the bottom about safety in the home, there's a little point on extensions and exceptions to temporary care agreements. So that's something we're trying to navigate and address with our Ontario Children's Aid Societies, that a temporary care agreement in a situation of AFCCA really should be extended well past the typical 12-month. That is something that caregivers, it may take much more time than 12 months to make the home safe again. It may take longer to find a residential treatment option for that child. So there needs to be changes in legislation and policy to help AFCCA families. And just exploring that model of shared care so that caregivers don't need to rescind their rights in order for their child to get the care they need. That absolutely shouldn't be happening, and it's happening all over the place. So this is something that is definitely kind of top of our list of what we're trying to do to remove barriers for our families and provide training. We're developing a provincial AFCCA community of practice that we're hoping to have many different professionals and caregivers to be a part of, to have a voice in the changes that are made. And I just wanted to share a little bit what we're seeing in our program. I know it's in its baby stages in the first couple of years, but we are finding that families are feeling so much more competent. That's been this outcome that we really weren't expecting. What we were hoping from the program was that aggression would decrease. And actually, aggression has decreased in some cases, but what we're seeing more so is changes in caregivers. Caregivers, because they're supported, they're feeling much better about themselves. The family's feeling more connected. There's changes in the perspective and narrative. And self-regulation piece, we've talked about polyvagal there, but the big one is the better boundaries. It really is something I remember the very first time I, as a caregiver, said out loud, "I'm not a doormat." And I hadn't said it, but it's something that I had to come to the realization to tell everybody in the home, "I'm not a doormat." And it seems simple, and it seems like some families might say, "Well, yeah, like, why didn't you have enough confidence to say that?" But the thing is, when you're living in this sort of situation, it becomes very easy to not speak up for yourself. So having those boundaries and be able to say it, and to be able to say, "I matter," like my kids matter, but I matter too, has been really important and a really good outcome for our community. I wanted to share a little piece about FASD and me, simply because this is something that our program at Adopt for Life offers any caregivers who are registered with our community, which I'll share about in a moment, are able to access FASD and me resources. And it's available in French or English. And we are finding that just filling out the FASD and me booklet together as a family can help children and youth understand their own system and can help them understand their own triggers. So if they're struggling with aggression, working through this process as a family can help you as a caregiver and them as well understand the triggers and the broader community, the classroom, the teachers, those they're involved with in extracurricular activities. It's just such an important tool. You can see the link at the bottom of the slide. Please do check out our FASD and me resources. And in terms of joining our community, we are a community at Adopt for Life, not just for adoptive caregivers, but kin and customary care. So customary care would be our Indigenous community. And kin caregivers, I neglected to say, our youngest actually was a kin adoption. And so we kind of have experienced everything in our family, but we want anyone who is a caregiver and also professionals. So professionals in the community, you can see the link there. You can join our community and register. And the support that is offered is pretty much immediate for caregivers in terms of being connected with a regional parent liaison, getting one-on-one support into our Facebook groups, our support groups. We do support groups through Zoom and through Microsoft Teams, where you can regularly show up and listen and be heard in a community of caregivers who all really understand what you're going through. So if there's anybody listening today who falls into those categories of adoptive, kin, or customary care and wants to join our community, absolutely, please visit our website and click join and fill out your information. You can also absolutely refer somebody to us. Send them this link as well. And there's a professional portal too. So we're in the process of developing special newsletters for professionals where we're going to be sharing some of our webinars, links for upcoming training, and also resources that they could share with their own professional community when it comes to not just AFCCA, but some of our Adopt for Life initiatives in general and upcoming events, that type of thing. And I just wanted to share our hashtag. You can see a support email if you wanted to send me anything more at the end of this. We are on all the social media outlets. Please give us a follow. But our hashtag, Stronger Together, I hope that's come through throughout this presentation and that you, those who are listening, are getting that message that it takes a village. It really takes a village to raise our children. It takes a village to be supported as caregivers. And we want to come together as a community. We want to break the isolation. So thank you very much for listening today. It was a pleasure to be able to speak with you. And I'll pass it back to Rob.
Thank you very much, Jen. I was taking a few notes as you were presenting along here, and some of the things that stood out for me. One was your focus on the importance of a safety plan and how that is that's an element that I think a lot of our families don't necessarily think about. And one of the things that Rural FASD is really blessed with is we do have on staff a behavior consultant of 30 years. And that's one of the things that he provides for our families is he'll come into our bail that stop funding and help them develop a safety plan. And we've certainly seen the benefit of doing that. The other one too is certainly the polyvagal that you were sharing with us. I hadn't heard that terminology before, and so certainly that being able to have some wording with that. I do know that one of the research studies that we were familiar with when we first got formed is we're aware that caregivers of people with severe disabilities such as FASD, 70% of them are going to have a mental health breakdown at some point in their lifetime. And so we know from that, you know, even from that shame standpoint and so on, we see this a lot. And so, like you said, being able to come together as a community, being able to support, being able to recognize we're not alone in this, such a powerful message. And like you said, to be able to have this courageous conversation on a topic that's difficult to talk about, for you to even share your own lived experience related to this, is we absolutely thank you for that, without a doubt. And then the last thing is I do know within our caring time we talk a lot about this concept of healthy boundaries and how key that is from a caregiver standpoint, and particularly when you were talking about nonviolent resistance. That's ultimately what it is recognizing that as caregivers, we have to have healthy boundaries without a doubt. So it's great to know that there is programming out there that folks can tap into, and certainly anyone that is listening today or watching today, definitely those are wonderful resources that Jen has shared, and we have certainly seen the benefit of exploring those. So thank you for that. And finally, to our audience, we once again thank you for taking the time to come and watch and learn, just in terms of parenting is tough, and we know that. And so you're not alone, and to know that there are people out there that care, that there are people that that you can tap into, we really would encourage you to reach out. So with that, I will leave you, and we will see everyone next month for our next presentation.